Hi guys, welcome back to another video. In this one we're doing part 4 of what if issei awakened his sacred gear earlier. I finally said it right, so yeah. So hope you all guys enjoyed this video. Hope to see you next video. Let's get into the video.
Making a great big show of thinking about it for a long moment, issei hums before eventually giving Riser a simple nod. Very well. My 3 fallen angels, for one of your back pieces. Riser's smarmy, smug face splits into a wicked grin at that, as the young devil clearly thinks he's gotten one over on issei. Excellent. Then it's settled. Turning to Graphia, Riser raises an eyebrow. I assume you can finish setting everything up. The moment Graphia answers him with a nod and a respectful bow, Riser vanishes in a flash of fire. It's obvious that the man has no desire to spend a single moment more in proximity to issei when issei has his fiancée pressed against his side. Smirking a little, issei slides his gaze over to Graphia, pinning the maid in place. Slowly, ever so casually, he slides the hand he has on Ria's shoulder down and around, and casually gropes one of the redhead's full melon-like breasts. As Ria mews and moans from the casual molestation, pressing herself further into his side rather than trying to draw away, issei just smirks at Graphia. I'm going to destroy him. You do realize that, don't you? Swallowing thickly, despite being far older than him, the maid jerks her head up and down in a janky sort of nod. Whether that's because of his true identity and power or because she's remembering his treatment of her, issei couldn't say for sure, but if he had to guess, he'd go with it being a combination of both. Chuckling, issei continues to have his way with Ria's tits, casually massaging his digits into her boob flesh through the blouse of her school uniform while Graphia can do nothing but watch. Then you know that your sacrifice was ultimately pointless. Letting me fuck you so that I wouldn't deflower Rias, all in all, you managed nothing more than a stalling action. I'm going to beat Riser senseless, sever his betrothal to Rias, and take Rias as my own all the same. He can feel Rias quivering and trembling in excitement beside him at his words. Meanwhile, Graphia is quivering and trembling for different reasons entirely, or, is she? So long as propriety has been maintained, it's fine. Issei blinks, and then laughs. He just laughs. Propriety? Ha. Pulling his hand off of Ria's tit, he instead slides it back and around and up, until he's got a fistful of her red locks. Guiding her head down to his lap, he never breaks eye contact with Graphia, even as her charge hurries to unbutton and unzip his pants, pulling out his cock and putting it in her mouth without him having to say a single word. Graphia flushes as the sounds of Ria's slurping and slobbering and inevitably choking on his cock fill the room. But to her credit, she doesn't say a word. After all, it's only Ria's virginity that she has to protect. Oral is fine. Issei guides Rias up and down his cock for only a little bit before letting her take the reins. The Grammary heiress is quite enthusiastic in doing so, deep-throating his member all on her own, even as Issei lets go of her hair and slides his hand down her back all the way to her shapely ass. He drags her skirt up until he can slip his hand under it, and he slides his fingers past Ria's panties, fingering her with his arm over the top of her head as she bobs up and down most diligently on his member. Graphia stays where she is the entire time, even when Issei's release finally comes and Rias chokes herself half unconscious trying to take him to his base and swallow every last drop at the same time. The maid doesn't move a muscle, staring at the scene with a flushed expression on her face and eyes that make Issei think she probably wished it was her in Ria's place. Regardless, much of his seed explodes out of Ria's nostrils and the sides of her mouth as she fails to properly swallow his load. Letting out a sigh and giving Graphia a "what can you do?" sort of shrug, Issei finally breaks eye contact with the maid to look down with a sympathetic smile at the struggling red-haired heiress. Rias looks right back up at him through her watery eyes and her involuntary tears, and immediately gets to work cleaning up after herself, swirling her tongue along his cock as she cleans him off with her mouth while at the same time cleaning herself up. Good girl. When he looks back to Graphia, the maid is gone, as if finally escaping being the center of his attention and gaze had let her come back to her senses and flee the scene. Not that it mattered, in the end. Issei had already gotten everything he wanted out of this meeting. XXX. You know, if you want to forfeit now, feel free. Issei lifts a single eyebrow at that, even as he stands across from Riser in a small arena. In another time, in another version of these events, Rias and Riser would have gone head-to-head in a rating game for the fate of her marital life. Rias and her peerage would have ultimately lost, and another version of Issei Hayado, one much weaker and much more tied to Rias like a dog on a leash, would have inevitably challenged Riser to a duel for his bucko's hand. In this place, in this timeline, they've cut out the middleman in several ways. Now it's Riser versus issei, for Ria's fate on the line. Well, and a few extra pieces as well. Issei slides his gaze away from Riser, ignoring the man's showboating for a moment in order to look to the stands. There, standing apart from practically everyone else, are his 3 fallen angels. None of them look particularly happy to be there. Nor were they happy when Issei had told them he was using them as a bet in a fight he was having with the devil. But it wasn't like any of them truly had a choice. They had effectively submitted to him, had bowed down before him and allowed him to conquer them. Truth be told, at this point he was pretty sure that at the very least, Kala Warner had outright fallen in love with his power. The other 2 were still scared of him, but also addicted to his dick at this point. Regardless, they were here as a show of good faith, since the additional bet that he and Riser had agreed to was officially part of the terms of this duel now. Riser's entire peerage was also there, watching on, and Issei's eyes raked over all of them as he slid his gaze from the fallen angels to them. He can pick out the back pieces from the pawns with relative ease, and he finds himself considering which one he'll pick once this is all over with. But he shouldn't ignore Riser forever, should he? Finally turning back to the impatient devil, Issei smiles somewhat blandly. Whatever do you mean? Why wouldn't I fight? Riser scoffs at that, bristling aggressively and leaning in to try and intimidate him. Come now, do you think I can't tell? You're weak. Even if you do have the Red Dragon Emperor sealed inside of you, it's obvious that you've only recently discovered that. Have you managed to unlock even a bit of his power, Surrender and I won't beat you senseless. I'm a merciful individual, after all. Issei just chuckles at that, rolling his shoulders and gesturing to Riser. Shall we begin? The smug smirk on Riser's face falters as Issei ignores his words, and the Phoenix growls, leaning back. Fine then. Let's do it. There's a countdown, as both fighters have made their intentions to do combat heard. The duel starts and Riser immediately lights him up with fire magic, the flames washing over Issei in an instant. It's an impressive display to be sure, a testament to the fact that Riser, for all his smugness, is indeed a fighter. If Issei were as weak as Riser thought him, the flesh would be burning from his body right now, his skin would be turning crispy, and he would be screaming in pain. None of those things happen. When the Inferno Riser summons has finally died down, Issei is standing there unscathed, mostly because of the red draconic armor he's now cloaked in. It's in the moment when everyone sees said armor for the first time as the flames fade to reveal Issei, that he lets loose on his power just a tad, allowing his presence to fill the arena. Riser's eyes go wide and his countenance becomes dreadfully pale as he immediately takes a step back in instinctive terror. Issei in turn takes a step forward, but rather than letting the Phoenix continue to retreat, his next step closes the distance between the two of them, Issei closing a gauntlet, clawed hand over Riser's face and slamming the devil down into the ground with a mere portion of his might. From what Issei had heard, the Phoenix clan was known for their relative immortality, their regenerative capabilities second to none in the underworld. Riser could replenish himself again and again and again no matter what damage he took, supposedly. Unless, that is, he took so much damage in one blow that it caused a shock to his system and left him unable to recover. Issei's first strike does not do that. But that's fine, because Issei doesn't stop at one. Still gripping the devil's face, he slams Riser into the ground repeatedly, again and again and again. He applies just enough force to do great injury to the Phoenix, but not enough to take him out of the fight too quickly. To his credit, at first Riser tries to fight back and heal himself, when he first recovers from Issei's overwhelming presence. The young Phoenix regenerates and attempts to slam more flames into Issei's face, which is currently the only part of him exposed. It does nothing, of course, not even singing a single lock of his hair. Issei responds by slamming Riser back down again and forcing him to regenerate once more. He keeps this up until finally, the devil he's fighting breaks. Please. I surrender, I surrender. It comes out a fair bit more muffled than that at first, of course, and Issei, upon hearing Riser's words, pulls his clawed hand back and cocks his head to the side, leaving the devil in the indentation he's created using Riser's body as he looms over him. I surrender. And like that, the duel is over. Issei has won. Not that it was ever in doubt, of course. As his victory is announced, there's a bit of a ruckus in the stands, and then Rias is down there on the field as well. Issei has just let his armor fade away when the red-haired missile slams into his chest. He catches Rias with ease, even as she kisses him heatedly, her tongue pushing past his lips and into his mouth. It certainly looks like Rias Gremory is happy he's won. Because Riser surrendered, they're able to heal the boy up and get down to brass tacks a bit faster. Namely, Issei finds himself face to face with Riser's peerage as Rias molds herself into his side and the fallen angels he's brought along for this little event stand at his back. Staring at the back pieces in particular, Issei finds himself thinking that there's not truly much of a choice here. After all, why would he settle for a rook, knight, or bishop when Riser has such a delicious queen? Riser's queen, who Issei knows to be named Yubelina, flushes under his gaze and fidgets and squirms, seeming to know that she's the most obvious choice, and judging by the way she's looking back at him with hooded eyes as she bites at her lower lip, she certainly wouldn't mind becoming one of his horde either. It seemed that female devils were naturally attracted to power, and Issei had that in spades. But even as he's opening his mouth to make his decision known, Rias' lips brush against his ear and she uses a gentle palm on his cheek to turn his head ever so slightly, directing his gaze to one of Riser's bishops instead, a beautiful blonde devil with dark blue eyes and her hair done up in drill-like twin tails. Once he's looking at her, Rias speaks in a soft whisper. That right there is Ravel Fenix, Issei, Riser's younger sister. Just so you know all of your options. Issei's eyebrows climb at that. He'd done a marginal amount of research into his opponent and his peerage, truth be told. He'd looked into the queen more than anything else, mostly because she was the most gorgeous choice. But finding out that Riser's little sister was in his peerage and thus up for grabs, did that change things? The others really weren't in the running, in Issei's opinion. In the end, it came down to a choice between Yubelina, the bomb queen, and Ravel Fenix, Riser's sister. Which did Issei want? Who was he going to claim as his own? More importantly, really, who was he going to take alongside Rias Grammary? Because there was no doubt in his mind that immediately after this, Issei would be fucking Rias, finally. He'd waited long enough, and from the way the Grammary heiress was rubbing up against his leg like a bitch in heat, so had she. So, who would he invite along to that particular rendezvous? Riser's queen, or Riser's sister? In the end, there was really only one true option here, wasn't there? Riser Fenix had been an irritant since Issei met him, an annoying braggart who deserved to be taken down a notch. Perhaps if Issei were a more forgiving sort of dragon, he would have been content with just knocking Riser senseless in the duel they'd just had. Perhaps he would have simply settled for taking the Devil's Queen and making her his own. But Issei was not that forgiving of a man or dragon, at least not when it came to other males. He might have a soft spot for women, but not men. And Riser was the worst sort of man. He was the sort who thought he could actually compete with Issei when it came to matters of the flesh. Rias belonged to Issei now, and Riser would have taken her from him. That required retribution beyond just public humiliation. It required a special touch. Issei lifts his hand up and points his finger at his choice. Not Yubelina, but Ravel Fenix, Riser's younger sister. I'll take her, the bishop. And then, just so everyone knows that he knows exactly who he's chosen, Issei continues on. Ravel Fenix, isn't it? There's a lot of freezing, a lot of whispers and murmuring, a lot of everyone looking shocked but also not shocked, and also quite dismayed. Issei just grins as he pins Ravel with his stare, and just like Yubelina before her, he can see the way his gaze makes her squirm. He can see that she enjoyed his display of power when he put her brother in his place. He can also see that he's utterly destroyed Ravel's world view. Obviously, the young blonde devil idolized her big brother. She probably believed Riser Fenix to be one of the more powerful devils of his age group or what have you. And truthfully, he might very well be. Issei had no way of knowing. After all, Issei wasn't a devil, he was a dragon. From the very beginning, his and Riser's matchup had been patently unfair, to tell the truth. But that was Riser's fault for daring to challenge a dragon over his horde. And now the devil would pay for it by losing his sister to Issei's clutches. After a few seconds of silence, Ravel seems to start and realize she's just standing there. He's picked her, so it's time to pay the piper. There's a moment where her bishop is extracted to be returned to Riser, and then the young blonde devil is walking forward, making her way to Issei's side as if in a daze. As soon as she's there, Rias activates a teleportation spell beneath them, and the three of them are subsequently transported away from the arena and to an ornate bedroom, Rias' bedroom more than likely. The moment that they land on their feet in the Grammary heiress bedchambers, she's positively throwing her clothes off, stripping naked then and there on the spot. Me first. Issei just grins at the redhead's exuberance. He knows full well that Rias has been jonesing for his cock ever since Graphia interrupted the two of them just moments before penetration. To be fair, he's been looking forward to this as well. Taking Rias' virginity will be quite the feather in his cap. Adding the redhead to his horde officially will also be quite the triumph. A daughter of the 72 pillars, all his. It's true, she's worth a lot as far as hoarding maidens goes. You're really moving up in the world, issei. Issei just smirks at Drake's words, before glancing over at Ravel. The blonde is currently standing stock still, watching Rias strip naked with wide eyes. She's trembling ever so slightly as well, and her hands are bunched up in the hem of her dress. Is she afraid? Issei hums at that, and steps between her and the increasingly naked buxom redhead that's waiting for him. His presence causes Ravel's gaze to snap towards him. He can still see the lust in her eyes, the desire, the inherent devilish submission to a more powerful being. Grinning, Issei reaches out and tucks a couple of fingers under Ravel's chin. Just wait your turn patiently for me, alright? I'll get to you in a second. Swallowing thickly, clearly not trusting herself to speak, Ravel just nods in agreement. Issei gives her a wink and then turns back to the matter at hand, namely, the more than a handful of red-haired devil currently waiting for him on the bed. Rias licks her lips as she sprawls out, posing for him in a lewd, seductive manner. Her full breasts jiggle with every breath as her chest rises and falls in anticipation, and her pussy lips are sopping wet down betwixt her spread legs. Slowly, Issei pulls off his own clothes, taking his time in removing his shirt and pants and boxers, revealing his chiseled figure to both Rias and Ravel. Rias greedily feasts upon his visage with her eyes, while behind him Ravel intakes sharply at the view, gasping in admiration. For the time being though, Issei keeps his attention solely focused on Rias. She's certainly waited long enough now. But, fighting always does make him randier than normal. More aggressive, one might say. As he climbs onto the bed, Issei has already decided he has no desire to fuck Rias on her back. It's too pedestrian, too plebeian. He wants to mount his newest maiden, he wants to take her like a beast, like a dragon. Reaching down, Issei grabs Rias by her hips and flips her over onto her belly. The redhead lets out a gasp, followed by a cooing moan as he drags her up onto her knees and she in turn languidly arches her back in response like a particularly pleased cat, even as her heart-shaped derriere presses into his cock. His length hot dogs Rias' ass for a moment, the redhead looking over her shoulder at him, licking her lips suggestively. If you want to take that hole first, I wouldn't mind. It's a testament to how hot to trot Rias is right now. She was already prone to submission because of her instinctive devilish nature to bow down before greater power. After she got an initial taste of Issei's power all that time ago, that day back in his living room, well, she was already lost, already his. But now she's just watched him utterly destroy his only competition for her heart in battle. That's why Rias offers him her anal virginity alongside her cunt, but while Issei intends to take it eventually, he's not going to leave her actual virginity intact for 1 second longer. Grinning at Rias, Issei draws his cock back until it's fallen out of her ass crack and is pressing up against her pussy lips. I'll keep that in mind. Then, he thrusts into her, filling her with his cock, and tearing through her hymen right then and there. Rias' back goes ramrod straight as her head tilts upwards, her mouth opening in a silent scream for a moment, but as Issei grips at her gorgeously wide hips and begins to fuck her with purpose, clapping into her fat ass with every thrust, that silent scream quickly becomes very vocal indeed. Oh fuck. Issei just grins at the appreciation of his talents, even as he plows Rias from behind, fucking the former virgin with abandon. He grunts and growls as he takes her with every inch of his big, fat, long cock. She's quite tight, of course, and with the body of a porn star to boot. It's too bad for Ravel that she's going to have to follow this, because despite being the same age as Rias and Issei, Ravel simply doesn't have the same body type as the Gremory heiress. That's okay though, Issei will still show her the pleasures of the flesh as he claims her for his hoard. He likes all women, at the end of the day, but there's no denying that Rias Gremory is a bit special. The buxom redhead rocks back and forth as he plows her from behind, her entire body shaking and jiggling from impact after impact. Her cunt quivers and squeezes down as hard as it can around his pulsing, throbbing shaft, and her ass cheeks make for soft cushions as he hits them over and over again with his crotch. The two of them fall into a rhythm as Issei mounts Rias right there on her bed and fucks her to kingdom come. The steady slap, slap, slap of flesh against flesh is only drowned out by Rias' moans, squeals, and screams as she creams herself once, and then multiple times over. As soon as the redhead's first orgasm hits, it's like the floodgates have been opened up entirely. She simply can't control herself, eyes rolling around in her head, tongue lolling out of her mouth. It's alright that she's losing control, in the end, Issei's quite happy to take it all for himself. Reaching out, he grabs a fistful of Rias' red locks and pulls at the beautiful young woman's fiery mane, dragging her head back and twisting it around so he can lean over her and plant his lips on hers. Kissing her hungrily, Issei less makes out with Rias, and more dominates her mouth with his own, his tongue pushing past her lips and wrestling her tongue into submission in the process. In every possible way, Rias submits to him. In every possible way, she lets him have her. As her sopping wet insides clench and squeeze down on his cock in violent orgasm after violent orgasm, Issei lets out a loud groan, and ultimately begins to come. He sees no reason to hold back any longer, not when he's already claimed his latest maiden, not when she's already fucked half senseless on his cock. He spills his seed deep inside of Rias' womb, filling her up to the brim with his white, hot cum, and then he pulls out with a grunt, his cock still fully erect and throbbing for more. More he will take, but even as he contemplates Rias' asshole, given that the redhead offered it to him and he's now all lubed up for it, Issei ultimately decides against it. He will claim Rias' every orifice eventually, including her ass, but for now, he's trying to be considerate of dear Ravel. Riser might have been a prick, but that didn't mean Issei had to take things out on Ravel. Instead, he uses his grip on Rias' hair to bring her around to his member, thrusting his messy prick into her moaning mouth and gagging her on it. To her credit, the Gremory heiress immediately begins sucking on his length, slobbering all over it and slurping away at his shaft until she's completely cleaned him up. Issei uses her mouth to clean his entire cock for a good little while, and then he pulls back with a grunt, pushing Rias back onto the bed and moving away from her. As she lays there, touching herself and fiddling with her cream-pied pussy, Issei climbs off the bed and turns his attention onto the other girl in the room, fully expecting Ravel Fenix to still be where he left her, frozen in place and awaiting his advances. As such, he's a little surprised when that's not where she is at all. In the time since Issei began to fuck Rias, Ravel has moved over to a nearby chair, and more than that. The daughter of the Fenix clan has removed her clothing, leaving her in nothing but her bra and panties, which have been flipped up and pulled to the side respectively, her tits, much smaller than Rias, on full display, and her own juicy wet cunt currently being stuffed with her fingers. She immediately stops masturbating when she finally realizes that he's finished with Rias and moved on to her. At the slightly perplexed expression on Issei's face, Ravel grins a raunchy grin, and he begins to realize he's underestimated the blonde devil entirely. Hopping to her feet, standing there in nothing but her underwear, Ravel licks her lips salaciously. How do you want me, sir? Do you want me to fight it? She makes a scared face as she looks down at his cock, shrinking away in what almost looks like honest fear. Oh and no, that's much too big. Why you brute, don't you dare bring that thing anywhere near me. Just as quickly, she drops the act and gives him a sultry look. Or maybe you'd like me to play the servant. I could be your maid. Master. With a twirl of her fingers, Ravel summons a French-made uniform, much frillier and also much more revealing than what Grafia wore. As she twirls in it, the blonde looks at him expectantly. How do you want me? It seemed Issei had a choice here. Ravel wasn't quite the pure maiden he was inspecting, but she certainly seemed like she was going to be fun all the same. The only question was, how did he want her? Did he want her to play at being reluctant, to make him work for her pleasure as he ravished her against her will and took her hard until she was screaming his praises? Or did he want her to serve him as his maid, the perfectly dutiful and altogether lewd servant? Or maybe a third option. Did he want to be gentle and loving, just to fuck with her? He'd gotten most of his aggression out of his system by fucking the shit out of Rias, if he was being honest. After how hard he'd fucked the redhead, he could certainly take things more slowly with Ravel, and given how lewd she was turning out to be, lovemaking might just be exactly what he needed to tease her. Decisions. As Issei stares at the young devil in silence, he reflects on his mistakes. In his haste to take revenge on Riser Fenix for thinking that he could possibly lay claim to Issei's property. Even if Riser was technically there first, Rias had offered himself to him, and that made her part of his horde. He hadn't really given much consideration to who Ravel Fenix truly was as a person, now had he? He wasn't entirely sure what he'd expected from the blonde. He'd known she was lusting after him, but if you'd asked him beforehand, he would have said that Riser's queen was the kinky one, and Ravel Fenix was likely more of an innocent young noble lady in need of a good buggering. Instead, it turned out that Ravel was quite the kinky minx herself. Yes, that was the best word to use for her. She was a minx, and it was obvious she wanted to be treated like one. Issei wasn't always inclined to give people what they wanted though. He'd had his fun with Rias, and now maybe he would have his fun with Ravel, but in a different way. He'd been aggressive, rough, and brutal with Rias Gremory, taking her virginity and claiming her as his own in her entirety. She'd loved every bit of it of course, but while he was still quite erect right now, Issei didn't feel a need to bend Ravel over and take her as roughly as he had Rias. Nor did he have any real inclination towards making Ravel play the maid. Maybe if it'd been his idea rather than hers, Maybe if she was haughty and against it he would have been more tempted, but she was all too into the idea, and he felt the need to mess with her, to fuck with her as he fucked her. Grinning a bit, Issei shakes his head in response to Ravel's question. She's still wearing the French-made uniform, so upon seeing his negative response, she hums and magics it away, standing there once again in the nude. Maid not do it for you? Then, what? Slowly, like a dragon prowling towards its prey, he stalks across the room, crossing the intervening space between them. As he approaches, Ravel bites her lower lip and squirms a bit more, starting to pant in anticipation of whatever he's going to do. By the time he's fully closed the distance, she's bright red, her naked nipples are rock hard, and her pussy is leaking, down betwixt her thighs. Her entire body is tense, thrumming with anticipation as she very clearly expects Issei to suddenly burst into violence, grabbing her and taking her just as he had Rias. Which is why it's such a surprise for the blonde when he instead gently tips her chin upwards with one finger, leaning forward and laying a soft, chaste kiss to her lips. She kisses him back of course, but it's obvious from her blinking eyes that she's confused, unsure of what he's doing. Issei just continues to kiss her, not even using tongue, simply pressing his lips into hers again and again for several long moments. When she herself tries to apply tongue, she's thoroughly rebuffed. When she tries to grab his cock and stroke it, he takes hold of her wrists and gently pries her off of him, before lacing his fingers with her own as he holds hands with her. Ravel's eyes go wide and her blush intensifies to atomic red levels as he continues to lovingly make out with her, all while they hold hands. Their fingers brush and squeeze against one another, his larger masculine hands eclipsing her smaller, slender feminine fingers. But he never goes beyond gentle domination, never takes control or anything like that. He does slowly draw her back though, away from Rias and the bed, over to a nearby chair where he sits her down by backing her up into it until she's forced. He doesn't ever let go of her hands though, even as he disengages from her lips, even as he kneels between her legs. He holds them and stares up at her as he dips down betwixt her thighs. His tongue presses into Ravel's dripping wet cunt, and he's rewarded with even wider eyes from the blonde devil, followed by a whimper and a quiet keening sound, before she finally finds her voice. What are you doing? Smirking, Issei gives Ravel's cunt another long lick before pulling back just enough to speak. Having my way with you. Why, something wrong? As expected, Ravel clamps up, her demonic pride not allowing her to admit that she's surprised. Issei leans back in again and goes right back to licking at her cunt. Given that she was vigorously masturbating to climax the entire time that he was plowing Rias senseless, Ravel is already quite wet. The blonde devil has probably already orgasmed once or twice, just from watching him fuck her fellow pure blood into the bed as hard as he could. She's on a hair trigger as a result, and it doesn't take long for her to come. Issei collects all of her pussy juices onto his tongue, finding them to be quite sweet indeed, like freshly plucked strawberries. Then, as she's still panting and mewling, recovering from his initial assault, Issei grins wickedly and allows his tongue to transform, going from human to something more draconic, more serpentine. The forked mouth muscle elongates and slides up into Ravel Fenix's drooling quim without issue, going up, and up some more until her heavily lidded eyes snap wide open once again and she looks down at him, finally realizing that something is off. Issei responds by flexing his tongue, thrusting it this way and that against her tight inner walls. With a shriek, Ravel orgasms yet again right on the spot, shuddering as she doubles over his head. His fingers are still interlocked with her fingers, they're still holding hands, so all she can really do is squeeze down harder on his grip, unable to do anything else. He's effectively locking her down, dominating her even now, but in a gentle manner, focusing on her pleasure above all else. Of course, part of this gentle domination means giving her some measure of freedom. In the end, she finds it, though he's not sure if it's a conscious or involuntary act when she finally wraps her slender, pale legs around his neck, bringing them up and draping them over his shoulders, before ultimately squeezing them together to bring his head further into her gushing cunt. Issei doesn't mind, he just keeps on licking, knowing full well that he can break free at any time. She's not locking him in, nor is she making him do anything he doesn't want to be doing. If anything, Ravel is the one in duress, moaning, mewling, panting heavily as she tilts her head back under his ministrations, his tongue continuing to writhe away inside of her juicy, virgin cunt. Because she is a virgin. He can feel her hymen even, and he knows he's going to take it today, going to take her virginity. Unlike Rias, Ravel is not the heiress to the Fenix clan. She is a spare, more than that, she is a girl, so all of her older brothers, of which Riser isn't even the eldest, come before her. That, Issei assumes, is why she was part of Riser's peerage in the first place, because she wasn't due to get a peerage of her own for some time, if ever. In fact, it was entirely possible she was never going to get one, that her family was just waiting to find someone to pass her off to in order to advance their cause. That was probably why they'd let him take her without a fight, though Issei liked to think they were still quite upset about it. He wondered if they would make any effort to get her back, but such things didn't bear thinking about at the moment. He was neglecting his current lover by letting his thoughts wander. Not that Ravel felt all that neglected if her sweaty, panting body and her gushing cunt were anything to go off of. Eventually, the strength has left her entirely, her legs relaxing their cute grip around his neck. Pulling back, Issei decides that he's had enough foreplay, and is finally ready to move on to the main course. Continuing to hold hands with the Phoenix girl, Issei pulls Ravel up out of the chair, only for her to nearly collapse as her weight hits her legs, which have undeniably turned to jelly at this point. Chuckling in amusement, Issei just picks her up, holding her like a groom might hold his bride, as he walks her over to the bed. Rias is still on said bed, of course, but there's plenty of room for multiple people. Laying Ravel down on her back, Issei moves atop her, just as the blonde is beginning to catch up with what's happening, her tired eyes blinking as she looks up at him and licks her lips. Unable to help himself, he leans down and captures those lips again, kissing her once more. This time though, he adds a hint of tongue, escalating the sweet, tender love-making he's drawing her into. Sliding betwixt her legs, his cockhead finally finds purchase at her dripping cunt lips. At the same time, Issei's hands find Ravel's yet again, and he happily interlaces his fingers with her fingers once more. Then, he slowly, ever so tenderly, enters her. It's a quiet affair, a gentle sort of penetration. He takes his time, even as Ravel's sopping wet pussy tries to speed things up. Rather than pushing him out, at this point she's downright trying to suck him in, even as she mules into his mouth, lashes fluttering from the sheer amount of vanilla that he's serenading her with. A devil like Ravel might be a very lewd creature indeed, a very kinky minx, but it was obvious she had no idea what to do with a bout of passionate, gentle, and altogether tender lovemaking. As Issei finally breaks her hymen and claims her virginity, there's a moment when the young blonde whimpers from the pain, but the sheer amount of foreplay and the number of orgasms that he's already drawn out of her make it a passing irritation at best. And then he's inside of her, slowly pushing in and out, making love to her rather than fucking her, experiencing her, rather than plowing her silly or ravaging her. Yes, from the way her eyes fill with abject arousal and her face contorts in ecstasy and pleasure, it's obvious to Issei that this female devil is particularly weak to this line of attack. In the end, Ravel's entire body shudders its way through more than one orgasm as he makes love to her in the missionary position. They're not beneath the covers and the lights aren't off, but even he isn't that much of a sexual deviant. All in all, Issei rather enjoys the temporary change of pace, thrusting in and out of Ravel at a slow but deep and fulfilling speed, until her tight cunt walls finally manage to milk him of his release, causing him to unload deep inside of her. Once he's filled her with his seed, Issei pulls out and flops over onto his back, landing right between the two pure blood devils he just finished claiming. Moments later, the both of them are curled into his sides quite happily, Ria's much larger rack squishing into his chest as Ravel nuzzles his neck. Smirking, the young man wraps his arms around them both, utterly satisfied, for the night, anyways. With a simple yawn, he lets himself nod off to sleep with 2 armfuls of gorgeous feminine flesh pressed into his body. XXX. Waking up the next morning to sunlight suddenly streaming across his face, Issei blinks at what he sees waiting for him at the end of the bed. Neither Ravel nor Rias are still at his sides, instead, the 2 minxes had clearly snuck away at some point, because both of them are up and about, moving through the room, carrying platters of breakfast food and wearing kiss the chef aprons, and nothing else. There's no denying it, the naked apron technique is super effective against Issei himself, and it's not long before the young dragon's cock is standing fully at attention. Rias and Ravel's eyes both zero in on his erection, lighting up at the sight of it, but rather than leaping to attend to his full mast, they share a look and a simple nod. In the end, it seems that Rias gets the short straw, or perhaps the long straw, depending on how you view it. Nestling herself between his legs, the redhead begins to bob up and down on his member in a rather pleasing display of a morning blowjob. Ravel, meanwhile, brings the breakfast food they've had made over to him and sits down on the edge of the bed, beginning to feed him, which Issei allows. As she offers him morsels and he snaps them out from between her fingers, his tongue moving over her digits all the while, Ravel flushes and bites her lower lip, finding her composure for a moment before finally speaking. So, Rias and I were talking, while we made breakfast this morning. Issei hums and nods his head in acknowledgement, prompting Ravel to continue. She told me how she suggested me because my loss would hurt my brother the most. Now, while it might be true that my family is likely up in arms over you claiming me, and Riser is almost certainly getting an earful over it, there's no denying that Yobelina is his favorite toy. So, as far as harming him personally goes, it really is a toss-up, truth be told. Issei just hums some more, chewing on both the food she's offering him and her words, even as he gestures with one hand for her to go on. Licking her lips, leaning forward enticingly even as she continues to feed him, Ravel thinks for a moment, before continuing. There will be an offer made for my return, likely within the day. If you want, you could have us both. Yobelina and I mean. If you agree to trade me back to my family for my brother's queen, I can lobby with my parents to keep from having to return to my brother's peerage, and eventually, I can rejoin you at your side, willingly. He considers her for a long moment. The thing is, he believes that she's telling the truth. He can see it in every fiber of her being, she does want to return to him. The only question is, does he want to give her up for even a moment? And it might be longer than a moment, she was being very careful not to mention time frames. He might be able to trade her for Yobelina within a day or two, but how long it would take her to get back to his side, she clearly couldn't say. Loath to part with any of his horde of maidens, Issei nonetheless considers the offer. He has a choice in front of him: reject any attempt by the Phoenix clan to get their daughter back, or trade her for Yobelina and risk losing her to others' machinations.
So yeah guys, that's it for this part. Hope you all guys enjoyed. Hope to see you next one. See you guys, bye.